On a summer night in Seattle, a young singer left a friend's apartment and stepped back into the dark. She was 27 years old. Her band was rising. Her city knew her voice. But just a few hours later, Mia Zapata was found dying on a quiet street in South Seattle. For years, the case seemed to slip further away. No eyewitness stepped forward with the answer. No known enemy emerged from her past. No simple motive tied everything together. And yet, the truth had not disappeared. It had been left behind in silence, inside a tiny biological trace, a piece of evidence collected in 1993, preserved, stored, forgotten by time but not destroyed by it. For almost 10 years, Mia Zapata's killer had no name. Then technology caught up with the evidence. A DNA profile was entered into a national database, and when the system finally answered back, the results shocked investigators. The match was not a jealous ex-boyfriend, not a figure from Seattle's music scene, not someone her closest friends had ever heard of. It was a man who had lived near the place where her body was found, a man who had already left Washington, a man who for years had remained invisible. This is the story of Mia Zapata, a gifted singer, a brutal killing, and a cold case solved by evidence that waited nearly a decade to speak. Mia Zapata was the lead singer of the Gits, a Seattle punk band known for raw energy, emotional force, and a sound that stood out even in a city crowded with music. By the summer of 1993, the band was gaining momentum. They had just returned from a successful West Coast tour. There was a sense that something bigger might be ahead. Mia was not just another local musician. She had a reputation. People remembered her voice. People remembered her intensity. People remembered the way she could command a room. Seattle in the early 1990s was alive with music, but also full of edge. Bars stayed open late. Neighborhoods blended youth, ambition, and instability. Capitol Hill in particular was a place where musicians, artists, and friends moved between taverns, apartments, rehearsal spaces, and all-night conversations. That world felt close-knit, and maybe that was one reason the case hit so hard. When Mia was killed, people assumed the answer had to be somewhere nearby, inside her life, inside her circle, inside the scene she moved through every day. But the truth would turn out to be far more random and far more frightening than many first believed. On the evening of July 6, 1993, Mia spent time at the Comet Tavern in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood. It was a familiar place. After midnight, she crossed the street to the apartment of a friend, identified in court records as TV. The apartment sat above a rehearsal studio. At some point, Mia went downstairs to look for her former boyfriend, Robert Jenkins. She wanted to talk about their relationship. That detail mattered early in the investigation. Whenever a murder remains unsolved, police begin with the victim's last known contacts. Who did they see? Who did they speak with? Who might have been upset, rejected, or angry? But what happened next remains one of the darkest gaps in the story. Around 2 a.m., Mia left the apartment and headed out alone. That is one of the last confirmed moments in her life. Somewhere after that, in the space between leaving her friend's place and the moment she was found, everything changed. No confirmed witness has ever fully explained how Mia crossed paths with the man who killed her. Investigators never established a known prior relationship between them. As far as her friends and bandmates knew, Mia did not know him at all. That is one of the most haunting parts of the case. The final chapter of her life seems to begin in an ordinary way. A late walk, a city night, a familiar route home. And then, A sudden encounter with someone no one around her had ever identified as part of her world. At about 3:30 that morning, Seattle firefighters were sent to 24th Avenue South, between South Yesler and South Washington Streets. There, they found a young woman lying on the pavement. It was Mia Zapata. Attempts to save her life failed. She was pronounced dead. The attack had been brutal. Investigators determined that she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The violence of the crime made it immediately clear that this was not an accident. This was homicide. And yet the location itself raised difficult questions. Was that where the attack began? Or only where it ended? How had she gotten there? Why that street? What vehicle, if any, had been involved? How many people had seen something and said nothing, or simply never realized what they had seen? For detectives, the early case was full of painful uncertainty. But there was one critical detail. The medical examiner noted injuries that could be consistent with bite marks and collected swabs. That decision would become the turning point of the entire investigation. Because although the technology of 1993 could identify the presence of saliva, it could not yet do what later science would make possible. The evidence was there. The answer was there. But the case would have to wait. In the months and years after Mia's death, investigators pursued the case, but no arrest came. The murder remained unsolved. Time moved on. Seattle changed. The music scene changed. But Mia's case did not disappear. It stayed open. Then, in 2001, a detective reviewing unresolved cases took a new look at the preserved evidence. By then, DNA technology had advanced. The swabs collected years earlier were sent to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory for fresh analysis. This time, the science went further. The lab developed a mixed DNA profile. One profile belonged to Mia. The other belonged to an unknown male. In June 2002, that male profile was entered into the National DNA Database. At first, there was no match. Then, months later, the system produced one. The DNA matched Jesus Mezquia. According to court records, the statistical likelihood of the profile belonging to someone else was extraordinarily small. Investigators now had a name, and the man behind it had an unsettling connection to the case. Mezquia had lived in Seattle from 1992 to 1994. At the time of Mia's killing, he lived about 1.5 miles from where her body was found. The woman he was living with had been out of town that night. By the time detectives identified him, he was in Florida. He had entered the DNA system after a felony conviction that required him to provide a sample. In January 2003, Seattle detectives arrested him in Miami. After being advised of his rights, he denied knowing Mia. He denied having sexual contact with her, but the evidence had already reached him before the detectives did. And unlike memory, unlike rumor, unlike theory, DNA did not need a confession to remain powerful. By the time the case went to trial, the legal question was no longer whether detectives had a suspect. It was whether the evidence proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecutors argued that Mezquia raped Mia and killed her. The jury ultimately convicted him of first-degree felony murder. That is important. He was not convicted on a theory of premeditated murder. He was convicted on the theory that the killing happened during the commission of rape. In 2004, the verdict brought long-delayed justice. On appeal, the conviction itself was upheld, though sentencing issues later sent the case back for resentencing. A sentence of roughly 37 years was later reimposed. In a legal sense, the case was solved. But emotionally, and even historically, Some questions remain open. How exactly did Mia and Mezquia cross paths that night? Did he approach her on foot? Did he offer a ride? Did he force her into a vehicle? Was she targeted in any meaningful way, or was the encounter random? Those answers were never fully established, and perhaps the most unsettling fact is this. The man convicted of killing Mia was not someone her friends recognized as part of her life. For years, people looked for the answer inside her relationships and her world, but the case appears to have turned on chance, proximity, violence, and opportunity. That randomness makes the story even darker, because it suggests that Mia's final encounter may have come not from a hidden conflict in her life, but from the terrifying unpredictability of being alone at the wrong moment. Mia Zapata was 27 years old, a singer, a writer, a woman with a future that still seemed to be opening. Her death shook Seattle, and for nearly a decade, the lack of answers left behind a different kind of wound. Not only grief, unfinished grief, a case suspended in time. What finally solved it was not luck alone. It was preservation. Someone collected the right evidence. Someone kept it. Someone reopened the file years later. And science reached the point where silence could finally be translated into identity. That is what makes the murder of Mia Zapata such a haunting case. Not only the brutality of the crime, not only the years without a name, but the idea that the truth was present from the beginning, sealed inside a trace too small for the era to understand. In the end, the answer did come, but it came late, and it could not restore the voice Seattle had lost. It could only close the distance between suspicion and certainty. For Mia's family, for her friends, and for those who never stopped carrying the case, that mattered. Justice delayed is not the same as justice denied, but delay leaves scars of its own. And in Mia Zapata's case, the road to justice stretched across almost 10 years of darkness before the evidence finally led investigators back to the man who had been there all along, just beyond their reach.